Hi, I'm Vass Bednar, and I host this Globe and Mail podcast, Lately.
And I'm Katrina Onstead. I'm the show's executive producer. So, Vass,
yes,
did you see that recent LinkedIn post from the disgraced FTX executive Ryan Salem? I'm sure he's in your network of crypto bros.
Yes, of course we're connected. I did see that post, though. It was widely shared on and off the platform, and I guess he appeared in a lot of LinkedIn searches that week.
Yeah, it was pretty good. Okay, so listener, if you have not seen this, here's what we're talking about. So after being sentenced to 7.5 years in prison for his involvement in Sam Bankman-Fried's multi-billion-dollar cryptocurrency scheme, Salem put up a LinkedIn post that read, "I'm happy to share that I'm starting a new position as an inmate at FCI Cumberland," with little cartoon dancing people jumping around a cupcake.
It's kind of amazing to have a sense of humor about going to jail. We had been talking about LinkedIn and how much it's changed, how it's slowly shifted to kind of the center of the social media experience, becoming much more Twitterfied and moving away from encouraging happy talk and support more towards kind of aggressive and provocative thought leadership.
Yeah, performative. And I know that it's becoming more successful because the more successful a social media platform becomes, the more I start feeling sick and anxious every time I have to engage with it. I'm like a weather vane. So for years, LinkedIn was such an inert place. Like it knew what it was. It was just a resume repository with the occasional cheesy, "I got promoted" post. But now it's just exhausting. It has all this hustle of Instagram. It gives me an ulcer. And comedians are also picking up on this new tension and comedy that exists and lurks on LinkedIn.
I'm excited to announce I've finished my beer.
Congratulations.
Thumbs up.
Keep up the good work.
I'm embarking on a new chapter and will be buying the boys a round of beers.
I endorse this round.
Fantastic news.
Looking forward to partnering with the boys again for another round.
Fantastic news.
Valuable insights.
Big things are coming. Beers.
Congrats on the beer anniversary. Excited to connect.
Congrats on the beer anniversary is pretty good, too.
Fantastic news.
Fantastic news.
That's a TikTok of 4 comedians, the troupe Kick It Forward, with their skit, "Do You Hate LinkedIn?" I mean, LinkedIn's also a place where, Katrina, you can share what your ulcer taught you about B2B sales.
Thank you. I will post that.
It has really changed, and our guest today has been tracking the platform's evolution from quiet, reserved outsider to Microsoft juggernaut into something much sloppier, sillier, and even scarier. Globe and Mail business reporter Tim Killads recently wrote this feature called "Bay Street Has a Secret Addiction to LinkedIn, and It's Getting Toxic." But it's not just Bay Street getting more performative, though. Teenagers, recent grads, service workers, and retirees are all joining the fray as we ask each other whether LinkedIn is quote-unquote cool now, which is what Bloomberg said, or a mess, which is what The Guardian said, or maybe a little bit of both.
Yeah, well, I guess that depends how you feel about more sharing, more personal, more political posts, that blur of work and life lines. You feel it there more than ever. And this model, annoying to me and some, does seem to be working. LinkedIn now has more than 1 billion members and has made $16 billion in revenue over the last 12 months.
Hashtag leadership, hashtag innovation, hashtag entrepreneurship, hashtag motivation, hashtag thoughtful.
Cupcake.
Yes. And Tim, who used to work in finance on Bay Street, or as he called it, the street, has an insider's eye on this evolution. And I had many questions for him, including this one. Do I actually need to be on LinkedIn at all? Side note, I'm on it right now. I hope you're open to the work of listening to this conversation. Welcome to Lately. Tim, welcome.
Happy to be here.
So, do you agonize over your LinkedIn picture?
I don't, only because it's my same Globe headshot.
So how old is it?
It's actually, well, it's really funny. We went through this recently. It's about 9 years old now, and they've recently just did new headshots.
And you
here.
resisted?
Yeah, but I actually emailed a number of friends and was like, "Do I still look like this?" And they
I
were
think
like,
you
"You're
do.
good."
Yes, this is audio, but you look remarkably like the avatar I saw of you.
Well, then we're good.
Congratulations. You're a business journalist. Presumably, you post articles on LinkedIn, maybe find sources for stories there. What was the change you saw happening on LinkedIn that made you want to write this piece?
So I actually used to work in banking. So I worked on Bay Street. So I was like the early beta testing round of LinkedIn kind of thing. And having gone to business school too, like a lot of people you would graduate and you would create a LinkedIn profile. It was kind of like this really mini online resume. And for the longest time, it was just this, I don't want to say dead site, but nothing happened. Somebody you went to school with might send you like a connection request and you'd click it and accept, and then like nothing would happen.
Yeah.
Around 2014 or so is when you started to see a bit of a change. And what they did is they tried to kind of branch more into what I would broadly call thought leadership.
Okay.
And so they tried to recruit CEOs and people like that to kind of weigh in on stuff. Maybe they went to some big conference and then they would give notes from the conference afterwards, or, kind of like relay their thoughts, that kind of stuff. But it was pretty like benign is how I would describe it. And then it kind of stayed that way for a while. And the real kind of like jump the shark moment is during the pandemic. And you had all these white collar workers working from home, and they were just lonely. Like we look back now and it's very clear that we all kind of lost our minds a little bit during the pandemic for various reasons. And people were posting out, like the one that always stuck out in my mind, it was like some employee who worked for like an official company or whatever, posted like a monthly certificate they got for like employee of the month kind of thing.
Yeah.
And I was just like, why are we doing this? Like, what's going on here? And everyone, if you remember that era, was so like humbled and thrilled. And, so it was a little bit more like makes you want to gag, but it wasn't like nefarious. That has now switched. And I would argue in the last 12 to 18 months, there's been like this revolution that's happened at LinkedIn. And a lot of people have been sucked in and they aren't aware of it.
So let's back up for a second. LinkedIn was kind of an early generation Silicon Valley startup, right? It launched in 2003. It actually predates Twitter and Facebook. What was the original promise of LinkedIn at the time it started?
The founder, Reid Hoffman, has talked about, the idea was like, oh, there's actually money to be made in people like identifying themselves. And then you can sell that to the corporate side of things. But for the longest time, it was really kind of struggling. It went public in 2011 and the stock had done well for a while because there was this rage around Facebook and Twitter, et cetera. But by 2016, it basically started to really kind of collapse on itself. And Reid Hoffman started talking about it in these ways that were, I guess, kind of not that bad given how tech visionaries talk about things now. But at the time, it sounded a bit ludicrous. Like, there was a line he had given to the New Yorker about how he wanted everybody in the world, every working age person in the world, to have a LinkedIn account, even like blue collar workers. And it would be this database of everybody. And you kind of sit back and say, well, like, why?
Yeah.
But again, it was just all about like scale and grow. And we're going to be this thing for the world. And then in early 2016, put out its bad earnings and its stock drops 40% in a day. And it was like, oh, something's wrong here. And then Microsoft swoops in. They had missed out on the social networking boom. And so they saw a way to get in. And that was through LinkedIn.
So when Microsoft bought LinkedIn, they paid $26 billion in 2016, as you said. How does the platform make money? Like, do you think that was a good investment?
So they have about $16 billion in annual revenue. Just less than half of that, $7 billion, comes from the recruiting side of things. So recruiters paying to get access to information on potential job applicants effectively. But then arguably just as important, brings in about $5 billion, is effectively like B2B marketing. So the line they give is like, listen, every CFO of a pharmaceutical company is going to be on LinkedIn. Mm-hmm. This is from the US side of things. If you want to target pharmaceutical CFOs because you have a new product you want to sell them or something, this is the place to do that. So it's kind of like targeted advertising. But to have those people check LinkedIn and kind of constantly see those ads, you need to have something there. And that there is, whether you want to call it the news feed or a feed of some sort. And they've really populated that with human voices. And those human voices are business professionals who now comment on it the way that you would comment on like Facebook.
And it's a big feed. I access it on the desktop. I feel like I'm one of few people that still do that.
No,
I don't have the app. Are you a power desktop user?
I'm a power desktop user, and then I recently got the app,
Yeah.
partly because I was trying to do more research for this.
Just
for this
research
piece.
purposes.
Yes, and it was actually crazy how much more addictive the app is.
Wow.
It was a really telling moment for me of like, oh, there's like, I get it even more now. And yeah, the desktop just, you feel a little bit more in control. In the app, it's just everything's thrown at you. And,
Doesn't update as quickly. It's just a bigger feed. Maybe that's why.
and there's just more going on in like a small screen. It feels more like barky, is how I would describe it. Carnival barker.
So then what about for users? Like, do people actually get jobs?
Well, one thing I will say, broadly speaking, is that talking to friends who don't really work in the businessy type space, and business is a broad bucket because that includes things like tech and banking and kind of any kind of white collar work now. They're really surprised often that LinkedIn has become a thing. They'll be like, LinkedIn, like seriously? It used to be this kind of like joke thing that people talked about, and I'm like, no, like it's real. And then I actually went and pulled some of the stats from Pew, which is audience research in the U.S. And LinkedIn is used by more people than Twitter, than Reddit. But if you want to reach rich people, I'm telling you, LinkedIn is where it's at. The highest proportion of its users make $100,000 or more a year. If you want to access CFOs or whomever, decision makers, this is where it is.
So you called it a revolution. What kind of clout does LinkedIn have now, post-pandemic? What are you observing in your own circle?
Over the past year or so, I've heard more executives talk about it. And there's one that really stood out in my mind. I went for lunch with somebody and they mentioned like, oh, I just had this panel yesterday and I posted it on LinkedIn and like it did really well. I was just like, are you an influencer now? Like, what is this? And to me, it's been really fascinating because it used to be that like executives had clout because they had the money and they were in a high-powered job. So like there was like a respect that came from that. And now that's not enough anymore. They want to have like influence in the social sphere, which I think on some level is what everybody wants, but there's clearly some sort of crossover that's happened with like the influencer trend in general.
Status. Yeah.
Yeah. And it kind of reminds me of like in Toronto, you go to like a Toronto Blue Jays game and like you're on the Jumbotron. Like, oh my God, I was seen. You know what I mean? It's totally playing into that type of thing. And it's just weird though that like the average person is excited that they're on the Jumbotron. But now you have like executives that are happy that they're on LinkedIn and getting that kind of social praise.
And then now that's what we're trying to do. We're all jockeying for the Jumbotron. Is there or was there for you like a tipping point, a moment that we can identify where LinkedIn kind of changed?
There was actually a period where LinkedIn was actually quite useful. And it's still, listen, I want to be very clear. It still is useful for a lot of purposes. But it was this era where those kind of like humble bragging posts ended and you could share stuff and you would see like real engagement. And at the same time, Twitter was descending into what I would call a hellhole, where it's just people yelling and shouting. So LinkedIn was kind of this like safe space. You're like, okay, this is good. I would argue that that safe space started to end around October 7th last year. And it's obviously a very controversial topic and anybody affected by it, understandably so, has a reason to kind of like say, you know what, I'm going to cross the corporate line here and just like speak from my heart on either side. So I get it, but it's that classic thing of like once the dam breaks, it just led to more and more and more. And then I noticed you started to see a lot more like anti-Trudeau posts. So it just became like more negative. Everyone was like more angry all the time. And it's never really recovered from that. And politics in this day and age and on social media incites rage and anger, and it makes people just more carnival barkers. But I think what people need to remember is that LinkedIn is also, in a way, encouraging this. Like, even if they're not explicitly saying it, what we've learned from social media is that the algorithm matters, and what's being shown to you is decided by something that they've set. Like, I actually heard from a lot of executives that LinkedIn's kind of like a nightmare for them. They'd be like, you would not believe how many messages we get from either it's from the recruiter side of things or people looking for jobs. Like the filtering is really bad. But I think, at least from what I can tell, that's kind of the way LinkedIn wants it. It's like you're getting this like smorgasbord of stuff that just like, so that every time you log in or click the app, there's a new notification.
Right. Or maybe an illusion of being really close or having people be more accessible than they actually are.
Yeah, that's a good point.
I'm also seeing more like super personal posts on LinkedIn. Again, blurring that line between professional zones, maybe. I've seen people posting about their kids, even a birth announcement, and kind of been hearing about this idea that it's now okay to, bring your whole self to work. What does this shift in tone, at least in our LinkedIn feeds, say about our relationship to work?
I'm really torn on what it all means because I don't think people have figured that out yet. I just think people are doing it because other people are doing it. But what really irks me personally is when people try to teach like a lesson out of it, because it just feels so corny.
Oh yeah, that's the total cringe meme format.
Yeah. So I think at the end of the day, what a lot of it boils down to is tone. And what I found quite interesting is like talking to people for this LinkedIn piece that I wrote, asking like, why were you so angry or so outspoken? You'd be surprised. Like a lot of people were like, well, I didn't mean it in that way. And I'd have to say, well, like that's how it comes across. And so I wonder if there's, I guess like a generational thing, because a lot of them tended to be older. They never really like grew up with like Facebook the way that I did. So they don't understand like even small things like about like where you use periods or if you use a period signals a lot, that you being a little more curt and sharp,
Another shift is that LinkedIn users can now post TikTok-esque short videos. I got to ask you, what's a LinkedIn influencer? This is a hilarious term.
I don't think they know what it is just yet because they only just launched this in the past few months. I've seen videos of like how to save $10,000 on your car. I think what is happening, and they have talked about this a bit at an investor day, is TikTok has branched a bit more into like personal finance advice. And so I think LinkedIn is worried that its moat, which is like business, could be stolen. So instead of waiting for that to happen, they're going to the other side and bringing that in.
But is LinkedIn trying to be cool? Like, is this part of why The Independent called LinkedIn the most cringe platform out there, the video element?
I don't think they're trying to be cool. I think they're trying to chase attention, like most social media networks.
Okay.
And I think that at large has become one of the big problems because all they care about is keeping you addicted. Like I get a lot of benefit out of social media, but this addiction matters, and what happens on these platforms matters now because those things are blurring into so-called real life. It used to be, there was this saying, Twitter isn't real life. We used to always say this. That has changed. And, the biggest example to me is in the presidential debate in the US, you have Donald Trump citing this lie that immigrants to the US and Ohio are eating cats and dogs. It is like the clearest moment that people are believing these things and spreading it up to that level. And that's why I worry about the addictive nature to it, because nobody can kind of understand what's real or not. Or there's a whole nother element to me, and maybe this is me being a dumb male, but there's a lot of like jealousy baked into the platforms now.
So I saw a study. It was published in the Journal of Occupational and Organizational Psychology that showed that AI might be able to pick up on narcissistic traits just from what someone posts on their LinkedIn page. What do you think the connection could be between narcissism and LinkedIn? Like, do you have to be a narcissist to be good at the platform, or does it just sort of amplify those traits in someone?
I do think there's a level of narcissism to it. But I would argue that narcissism is about social media in general. This idea that like my thoughts deserve to be heard, And at the end of the day, it's always about like, look how great this thing I did was. At the same time, I would also say that like you could probably correlate narcissism and like being an executive, because it's like, why do people want to rise the corporate ladder? Because they want money, power, and influence. How do you do that? So like there's these things kind of are intertwined.
Yeah. So do you think people are posting differently now on LinkedIn because Twitter and Facebook have become just worse places to exist? Or is there something that is totally different on a cultural level?
What I think is the case is that because LinkedIn kind of presented itself as this like pure place that wasn't going to be Twitter and you have to use your real name and there's no anonymity, it was seen as like a safer premium place in a way. And it's almost like that is being exploited now. It's like, oh, we're going to take the goodness of it and actually make money off that. And I mean this from the creators or the influencers, whoever, you know. At the same time, I do think that there's a corporate agenda. For the longest time, Microsoft bought LinkedIn, but kept it kind of separate. It was its own little entity within Microsoft. Now there's much more blurring of those lines, and they're integrating more and more AI into LinkedIn. And like at this Investor Day in June, it was very much about like, we're going to use Microsoft's AI. And remember, Microsoft has invested in OpenAI. So there's like a huge connection there. And we're going to tie that into LinkedIn. And so I think there's much more of like using LinkedIn as this test case of like how AI can be used in the workplace or used in a enterprise setting.
Yeah, I do want to talk about the content itself. I'm guessing that a lot of executives don't write their own posts, or not entirely, right? Maybe they have an assistant or a ghostwriter or a professional, right? Their comms department working on it. Now, LinkedIn has added this right with AI feature. We all know that the people whose names are attached to posts aren't necessarily the people actually writing the posts a lot of the time. So what are we even playing at here? Like, why bother?
This is so sad, but like, because I think part of it is that people don't care. Like, people want to see the pictures of the executives on the panel or whatever.
But do they?
I think so. Like, I think at the end of the day, people just want to be seen in whatever capacity possible. And when you see some executive posts from the corporate town hall, and it's like, you can see they have like 700 likes, it ties into this idea of like, why do people want to rise the corporate ladder? For money and power and influence. And it's like, I want to get to a point where like I have 700 people like my post, if that makes sense. That's what I think it is. But what I also want to point out that I found really interesting is that Mark Zuckerberg, he's been on this media tour recently. And one of the talks he gave was about like where social media is going. But in a very smart way, he was like, well, there's been 3 eras of social media. We're just about to enter a 3rd era. The first era was about personalization and like, you know, us on social media. The second era was about content creation and influencers. And the 3rd era is the AI era. And he said most content in the future is going to be all AI generated. And you can already see this on Facebook. Like, I rarely log in anymore, but it's all these random AI generated pictures and things of that sort. And people like don't really care. We'll just stay on it and on things like LinkedIn and not really care about the depth of the posts as long as there's just a new post.
Well, some of the new posts, I do see a lot more kind of genuine vulnerability on LinkedIn than I used to, especially in the current job market where there are people openly posting about how they're looking for work after being laid off. How do we square or make sense of that contradiction? Is this kind of a genuine openness and honesty in a place that often feels quite fake?
I think that a lot of it is honest, because not that long ago, like, it was embarrassing to write like, I got laid off and I'm looking for work. So I think that is one of these positive movements, particularly after the tech crash in 2022, and a lot of people got laid off. Because it was happening to so many people, it was like, well, we're just going to own this and put it out there. The problem now, though, is that like any trend, it kind of gets adopted by the wrong people and it gets commodified. But I think what it boils down to is that everything is being turned into narrative. Because at the end of the day, the human brain loves narrative. It's why we love stories. And AI, you know, if you give it the right prompts, will construct a narrative for you. And I think after a while, you're like, I don't need your full narrative. Again, like, I'm seeing somebody's content that like, I don't even know who they are. So I think that's part of the problem. It's just that you're being fed too much of it versus like things you would care about.
So do you think Microsoft's trying to build this out as a social media platform, or is their end game more oriented around fodder to train algorithms?
Maybe it's both. I mean, I do think that they really want to tie into the social networking thing because you see, one, you just see the usership. It's like almost as big as TikTok. But two, there was a news story that went around a few weeks ago about how they've set new settings where it's like automatically, I think the default is that your content is being used to train their AI. But for sure, like 100, like it's the same way that Twitter is probably going to be used for Elon's algorithm because, you know, AI models are only as good as the inputs into them, like in their databases. And something like LinkedIn or Twitter has live ongoing stuff that can feed potentially into a database and therefore keep their language models current. So I definitely think there's a play there.
You've been mentioning sort of coming of age on the internet and how you've seen the platform evolve. And for me, the fact that people can pay for premium memberships or different tiers of memberships does remind me of the early days of OkCupid, right? There's this element of pseudo surveillance on LinkedIn. You can pay more to see who's viewed your profile, or you can pay for anonymous browsing. I'm always nervous when I creep someone because I'm like, they're going to know. I went to their profile. What are they going to think? Why do we care about who's checking us out?
Because I think at the end of the day, we all just want to be cool. And whether that goes back to like some high school, you know, mental mind tricks that people played on us, that's kind of just like a human nature thing, right? Like think about how much of pop culture is derived from like being in the zeitgeist and being noticed. I just think people like the attention, you know, it's like, it's why people love a little bit of a flirt. You know what I mean? It's just like, you know, it's good to feel like you're desired or something.
Right? So we've been talking about how LinkedIn is changing, but is LinkedIn changing us and the way we work?
I do think that there is an element where some faction of the population believes that if it wasn't on LinkedIn, it didn't happen, which very much reminds me of Instagram and like younger people feeling like I have to post to prove that I was at the party. And I have had friends who work on the street say to me that they've been encouraged / straight up told to post when there's maybe like a deal that their company has done. We want to kind of like promote it. So it is tying into this idea of like, we need to market ourselves. How will anybody know we were involved if we didn't write about it, you know? So everyone's kind of a quasi-marketer now.
Can you be a successful professional and not be on LinkedIn anymore?
Yes, which is a very important thing. There are still a lot of people that are like, I find it crazy or whatever. So there is still so much that happens outside of LinkedIn. In the same way that even when like Twitter was at its peak, you know, there are scores of decisions that are being made daily that are done in rooms that are not on social media. They're being done in real life. You know?
I've heard of that place. Tim, I'm so glad we've been connected. I'd like to add you to my network.
You've been accepted.
You've been listening to Lately, a Globe and Mail podcast. Our executive producer is Katrina Onstad. The show is produced by Jay Coburn, and our sound designer is Cameron McIver. And I'm your host, Vass Bednar. In our show notes, you can subscribe to the Lately newsletter, where the Globe's online culture reporter, Samantha Edwards, unpacks more of the latest in business and technology. A new episode of Lately comes out every Friday, wherever you get your podcasts.